Today we're going to be looking at two synths that time forgot and asking the question, why? Let's find out. Hi, I'm Zach Marr from Alamo Music here in San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. And today we're going to be looking at two synths that time forgot. The Kawai SX240 and the Kawai SX210. So why were they forgotten? Kawai isn't necessarily associated with classic analog synth history. It's kind of a footnote, not one of the major chapter headings such as Roland, Korg, sequential, Moog. So why? Why did that happen? Is there something wrong with the synthesizers they designed? Why were they forgotten? So what's interesting is you kind of have to look at the history of Kawai synthesizers, and when you start looking into it, you find that it wasn't actually Kawai that manufactured the synthesizers. It was Teisco. So Teisco was a Japanese company that manufactured, starting in the 40s, up into the 60s when they were acquired by Kawai. And Kawai, through Teisco, manufactured synths from the 60s on through the 80s. And it was really its own kind of, it followed the developmental trends of analog synthesizers in general. They had their monosynths, they expanded the polyphony over time, they expanded the feature set. And a lot of those models are very similar to the classics. What's interesting about them is they're very different tonally than the classic Rolands, the classic Moogs, the classic sequentials, and Korgs. They have their own voicing and their tonality. And so it's really interesting that they're not as well known as these kind of other counterparts that are highly sought after. And these two in particular, the SX210 and the SX240, came in the early 80s and really are feature heavy. So if you compare it to other analog synthesizers that came out around that time, often they outcompete in terms of the features that are on here. So the question is, what went wrong? What was wrong with these that they didn't become a household name, that they didn't get written into the history books? So really, in my opinion, what happened, they came a little bit too late in the story. When these were released, the DX7 from Yamaha was overtaking the entire analog synth world. It really displaced all the other manufacturers and became the best-selling for years. And for a while, the other analog synth manufacturers struggled to keep up and find something to displace the DX7. I think Roland eventually did. I don't remember exactly which synth displaced the DX7 from being the bestseller, but it was a huge disruptor. And the move towards digital synthesizers was becoming quicker and quicker. So these came late. There was a trend towards the DX7, and there was a trend towards going digital. And digital became this new, it was a new thing, it was the new sound, and that trend continued on into the 90s and 2000s and really rendered analog synthesizers kind of to an obscure corner for a while, which was mainly occupied by enthusiasts. So they were kind of forgotten. They just were ill-timed and not particularly well marketed. So it's really interesting that these were kind of, could have been something, but they didn't. They didn't sell well, and there's not a whole lot of either of them. There's a couple thousand that are believed to be in circulation. So they're fairly rare, and they came at a poor time in the development of analog synths and morphing towards digital. So what's cool about them is they're actually like an alternate universe for analog synths. They are completely different in terms of tonality and really feature heavy. So you get a lot out of these things. They're capable of a lot. So a couple cons. So besides the reasons that it was kind of, in my opinion, these synths were forgotten, there is a couple design cons that I think have made these synths less palatable over time. And one of them, so on the SX210, the biggest kind of lacking feature is MIDI. It has no MIDI implementation, and there really is no connectivity. There you can't even CV connect to another instrument. It's all you can. It's all you're all tied into this instrument, so there's no way to get out of it. And there is retrofits available, but it's it's questionable whether or not that's worth doing to it. And you can read online, people argue about it all the time. Then the SX240, this does have basic MIDI implementation, and so it really doesn't have that issue. But what both the SX240 and the SX210 do have is the way you navigate through to modify sounds is through kind of, it's not menu diving, but it's very close. On the SX210, you select the different button and you modify it with a tone knob. On the SX240, you move through the different parameters via kind of some buttons, and then you modify with the tone knob as well. And so this is kind of an intermediary point between classic analog synths that you modified tones via knobs or sliders, and kind of the trend at the time, which was to hide all that and make people menu dive or use an outside controller. So like the JX series from Roland, which is also not particularly, there's not a huge collector community around those. They're fairly difficult to get deep into because the parameters your ability to change and sculpt sound requires an outside controller. This is not quite that far. You can edit every sound fairly easily. You just have to use this kind of either the buttons and the knob or the cursors and the knob. And so it's really it's an alternate universe again for working with the interface, where it's not the old world of sliders and knobs, but it wasn't the new analog world where you were locked out of most things unless you wanted to menu dive or had an outside controller. So it's like Teisco, who I forgot to mention earlier, when they also are known for manufacturing a whole bunch of guitars. And if you look at Teisco guitars, those are almost like an alternate universe of what the electric guitar could have been. You look at the designs, they're very interesting, but they look nothing like modern electric guitars. The history did not follow that path. There's a collector's community around Teisco as well, and they're worth checking out if you ever get a chance. They're very cool, and they tried very experimental things with them. The same really applies to these two synths. There's a bunch of things in here that never really made its way into the mainstream, so they're alternate analog synth histories in themselves. So what's cool about both of these, besides them having just a totally different palette, particularly on the SX240, it has the ability to go into, so one thing is they're both 8 voice, so they have 8 voice polyphony, which most of the synths at this time were at 6 voices, like the Juno 6, the Juno 106, the JX8P, the JX3P, those went up to 6. So this had 8 voice polyphony, which was pushing it. That was only the Jupiter 8 had 8 voice, and later on the JX10 I think had 12. But that was a pretty cool feature, that it had 8 voices of polyphony. It also, on the SX240, it had a dual and a split mode, fairly rare as well to find on an analog synth. Dual allows you to stack sounds, and split allows you to kind of take 2 sounds and split it in the middle of the keyboard. Something you find in the Jupiter 8 and a couple other synths. With analog synthesizers, it's very powerful because you're getting very complex sounds out of layered one and then also split. So you can do some really cool things there. The SX210 doesn't have that, but what they both also have is the Portamento and the I don't even know how to say that correctly, the glissando effect. And that was fairly rare to find both effects on an analog synth. You usually found one, maybe. So they both had that. The SX240 had a sequencer. I think it was like you could sequence 1,500 notes. Not the most intuitive sequencer to use, but you could sequence quite a few. And they both had hold functions. So really that's kind of... I'm trying to think of what else is unique about them. The SX210 is simpler. And the SX240, besides, okay, one other big difference, I forgot about that. This had two oscillators per voice, so you could do some really, again, that wasn't something you saw on the Juno 106 or the Juno 60. It's something that you began to see on like the Jupiter 8 has it, the JX8P has it, and the JX3P has it. And when you have two oscillators per voice, you can start doing really interesting things, creating like tuning them slightly differently to get kind of this natural grittiness or chorus effect. You can also, with the split, another cool effect you can do with the SX240 is you can have the LFO go to the different voices and create some really interesting rhythmic things because of the dual oscillators and being able to route the LFOs to the different oscillators. So really some cool sound sculpting that you can do on the SX240 that really puts it up there, in my opinion, with some of the classics. And it's not like a Me Too, it's a very different palette altogether. So really, the SX210 to me is not as interesting. It is a cool synth, again, because it has some different tones in it, but it's pretty limited in what you can do. And the fact that it doesn't have MIDI makes it even more limited. The ensemble, which is like the chorus effect on the SX210, is actually better on the SX210, and the ensemble effect on the SX240 is not as cool to me. So the choruses are slightly different. The tone between these two is also fairly different. Tonally, as I would describe the Kawai sound or the Teisco sound as very, very warm. It is dark and warm, and so it's almost melancholic in the way it sounds. It sounds super dark, and you can also get some really brassy effects that are pretty aggressive and overwhelming, which to me that's an interesting sound that they're able to make. So I think in summary, these are very interesting synths that I think deserve a place higher in analog history. They're not kind of Me Too products. They're also not bad sounding. They actually are super interesting sounding and kind of not in the history books. No major artist really use these to create any kind of noteworthy songs from what I know, what I can find online. I would love to, if you do know something that was some famous piece of music that was created on one of these, it'd be very interesting to please put it below because I'd be interested. But I think these could be resurrected in some way. Someone could use these, that there is no recreation or there is no VSTs of these things. So someone really could use these to make new music that I think would be very interesting and tonally different. So an interesting opportunity for somebody that wants a different sound. I think these are a perfect fit for that. If you're like, hey, I just am looking for a different tone. Very interesting. Fairly affordable in terms of if you compare these to other analog synths with similar feature sets from this time, this era, because they're not as popular, you can still get them rather affordably, I think in the $1,200 to $1,500 range. This one can get a little bit pricier. They're rare, but definitely worth checking out if you've never heard one. And we're going to dig a little into both of them, play a few sounds that I think are interesting. And so we'll do that, and then we'll wrap up. So let's listen. So what do you think? Should these have been forgotten? Do they deserve a place in synth history that they don't currently occupy? In my opinion, I think they do. And the reasons are, one, they're really powerful synths that outperform, from a feature standpoint, a lot of the other synths of that era in the same time period. Also, it is a completely different sound palette than the other, and not like a bad one, an interesting one that is very usable, a very interesting sound palette that is not really available in the other kind of historical synths or in any VST or kind of replica, modern in production replica, or even any replica that's planned, partially because they are obscure, they don't have a place in history. So what's interesting about that, in my opinion as well, it's an opportunity for music makers from today to use these incredibly powerful pieces of history to create modern music and create sounds that have really not been heard in popular music from what I know. And so I think it's an awesome opportunity for someone that wants a different palette and wants a different kind of ability to orchestrate and create different sounds. These are very interesting synths to kind of evaluate, take a look at. The SX240 I think is a better value than the SX210. But having said that, they're both different enough that they're both worth owning on their own. And what's interesting is they play really nice together because they have a similar palette. They're similar to each other, not really to other synths of the era. They really complement each other, and they're different enough that I think they're both worth owning if budget is not an option. So if you enjoyed today's video, please hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications. We're going to be doing more videos on the topic of synths that time forgot. We'd love to hear your ideas about what videos we should do, which synths have been forgotten, and which ones would you like to learn more about and hear. And if you'd like to just talk to us about synths in general, you can again visit us at alamomusic.com. You can call us there, chat with us, or email us at yourfriends@alamomusic.com. We love to hear from you. And thank you for watching today. I hope that you learned something, and if I can do anything better, please let me know again in the comments below. I'm sure I forgot something or left out a fact or misrepresented something. I love to know, and we'd be happy to correct it below. So thank you for listening, and until next time.